In the village of Umuji, the sun hung lazily over its golden rays, casting long shadows over the king's palace, its pillars adorned with intricate carvings of cultural symbols passed down through generations. Inside the royal courtyard, King Kanu sat upon his grand wooden throne, his brow furrowed in deep thought. The drums of the morning gathering had just ceased, but the king's mind was troubled. His three sons, Chima, Obi, and Nedu, were the pride of the kingdom, yet none had the wisdom necessary to rule. His eldest, Chima, was strong, skilled in battle, but too arrogant, always quick to anger. He believed that strength alone was enough to lead a kingdom. His second son, Obi, was clever, always scheming, but lacked a sense of loyalty. He thrived in deceit and manipulation, a shadow always lurking behind his father's decisions. And then there was Nedu, the youngest. Kind-hearted, thoughtful, but too soft-spoken and naive to handle the burdens of leadership. The elders had taught them, the warriors had trained them, the priests had prayed over them, but nothing changed. A kingdom without a wise heir was a kingdom doomed to fall. That evening, as the sky turned crimson and the evening horn signaled the arrival of dusk, a lone figure approached the palace gates. The palace guards stiffened as they beheld the stranger. A tall, gaunt man, his frame draped in a dark robe woven with cowrie shells and ancient markings. He carried a long staff, his handle carved with twisting serpents, and on his face a knowing smile. The palace herald announced his presence, and the king, curious yet wary, permitted him entry. The man walked with measured steps, his presence sending an uneasy ripple through the court.
Great King Kanu,
The man greeted, his voice deep and steady.
I have traveled far, for I have heard of your plight.
The king's eyes narrowed. Who was this man? He did not appear to be an ordinary traveler.
I am Dibia Oko,
The man continued, his gaze unwavering.
and I bring you a solution.
A murmur spread through the gathering elders and chiefs. The king had not summoned a Dibia, yet one had come, offering answers.
I have the knowledge to make your sons the wisest in all the lands. I can shape them into scholars, rulers worthy of your throne.
The court fell silent. The king leaned forward. Could this truly be the answer?
And what do you ask in return?
A slow smile spread across the Dibia's lips.
When I return them, you will choose two to remain with you. The third shall be mine.
A cold wind seemed to blow through the chamber. The weight of the demand hung heavy in the air. The king's heart pounded. To give away one of his own blood? The chiefs exchanged glances, some whispering among themselves, but none dared challenge the king's decision. The future of Umuji was at stake. For long moments, the king sat still. He thought of the sacrifices of past kings. He thought of his people, his legacy, his throne. Finally, his voice, steady but heavy, broke the silence.
So be it.
A collective breath was drawn from the court. The Dibia nodded as if he had already foreseen this moment.
Prepare your sons, king. At sunrise they shall journey with me.
And with that, the deal was sealed. That night, Chima, Obi, and Nedu were summoned before their father. The king studied them closely. These were his flesh and blood, his pride, his hope.
At dawn, you leave with Dibia Oko.
He said, his voice grave yet firm.
You will return as men of wisdom, but one of you will not return to this palace.
Chima frowned, his fist tightening. We are not children. We do not need the sorcerer's wisdom. Obi, ever the schemer, simply smirked, his eyes calculating.
So we are to be gambled away like cola nuts, father.
Nedu remained silent, his mind racing. Why had his father agreed to this?
Go and rest.
The king commanded, his voice final.
At sunrise, you leave.
And so, as the moon cast its pale light over Umuji, the three sons of King Kanu lay awake, their fates now bound to the Dibia's promise. The morning would come too soon. The rooster's cry echoed through Umuji, signaling the arrival of dawn. A soft mist clung to the village paths, and the air was thick with the scent of dew-soaked earth. The palace courtyard was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that weighed heavy with uncertainty. Three figures stood before the palace gates, their travel bags slung across their shoulders. Chima, Obi, and Nedu. They were dressed in simple warrior tunics, their sandals laced tightly around their ankles. Beside them stood Dibia Oko, his tall frame covered in his dark robe, his eerie, sacred symbolic script marked staff clutched in his bony fingers. Behind them, King Kanu watched in silence from his throne, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Queen Lolo Adara held her hands tightly together, her lips pressed into a thin line.
Remember,
The king said at last, his voice measured.
you will return wiser than you are today, but one of you will not come back.
Chima's jaw clenched. Obi simply smirked. Nedu, the youngest, lowered his gaze, feeling the weight of his father's words in his chest. Dibia Oko lifted his staff and slammed it once against the ground.
It is time.
Without another word, he turned and walked forward. The three princes exchanged looks, then followed the mysterious sorcerer into the unknown. The road out of Umuji was long and winding, leading away from the lush farmlands and bustling market roads into the darker, quieter parts of the land. They traveled for hours, their feet crunching against fallen leaves, the whispers of the forest surrounding them. The air became thicker, heavier, as though they were stepping into a world unseen by ordinary men.
Where are we going?
Chima demanded, his patience running thin. Dibia Oko walked ahead without turning.
To my home. There, you will learn things that no other men in this kingdom know.
And what if we do not wish to learn?
Obi asked, his voice laced with amusement. This time the Dibia stopped. Slowly he turned to face them, and for the first time his dark eyes seemed to glow faintly.
Then you will not leave.
He said simply. A chill ran through Nedu's spine. The journey continued in silence. By nightfall, they reached the edge of a large blackened valley, beyond which lay a massive compound, a house unlike anything they had ever seen. It was built from dark wood, its doors lined with mystical carvings, and at its center stood a massive Iroko tree, its branches stretching toward the heavens.
Welcome to my domain.
Dibia Oko said. Inside the house, the walls were lined with old scrolls and bottles of strange powders, their surfaces covered in ancient inscriptions. A large fire crackled at the center of the main hall, its smoke twisting unnaturally toward the ceiling. The Dibia turned to them.
This house is yours to explore, but you must never enter the last chamber.
His voice was firm, his gaze unblinking. Obi smirked.
And why is that?
The Dibia's face remained unreadable.
Because some doors should never be opened.
With that, he handed them keys to different rooms.
Rest. Tomorrow your lessons begin.
And with that, he left them alone. Chima wasted no time throwing his bag onto a nearby cot, his expression set in frustration.
This is madness.
he muttered.
We are warriors, not scholars.
Obi chuckled.
And yet we are here.
He tossed his key in the air and caught it.
Did you see how he looked at us? This Dibia is hiding something.
Nedu, who had been silent all evening, clutched his key tightly. He too had sensed the strangeness in Oko's presence, the way the shadows in the house seemed to move even without wind. Something about this place was wrong, and it would not take long for them to find out why. That night, when the house had fallen into deep silence, Nedu could not sleep. He tossed and turned on the stiff cot, his mind troubled. He had always been the most curious of the brothers, the one who questioned everything. And right now, there was only one question in his mind. What was inside the forbidden room? Slowly, he rose to his feet, glancing at his brothers who were fast asleep. Then, moving as quiet as the night, he slipped out of his chamber and into the darkened hall. The house was eerily silent. The only sound was the soft creaking of the wooden floors beneath his feet. And then he saw it. The forbidden door. It was larger than the others, carved with spiraling symbols, its wood almost blackened as though it had been burned by something unnatural. Something about it called to him. His hands trembled as he reached for the handle.
You should not be here.
Nedu spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Dibia Oko stood in the shadows, his piercing gaze fixed on him. For a long moment they simply stared at each other. Then quietly Oko said,
Curiosity is a dangerous thing, child.
and just like that, the door slowly creaked open on its own, revealing a dimly lit chamber beyond. A strange golden mist curled from inside, drifting toward the corridor like a living thing. Nedu's breath hitched. Behind him, Dibia Oko stood still, his piercing gaze unreadable. His dark robe fluttered slightly, despite the still air.
You were warned, child.
Oko murmured, his voice calm yet heavy with meaning. Nedu hesitated. His curiosity and fear wrestled inside him. He had not intended to open the door, at least not tonight. But now that it was open, something within him needed to know. Stepping forward, he crossed the threshold into the forbidden chamber. The room was nothing like the others. Inside, stone walls stretched high into darkness, carved with sacred symbolic script glowing faintly against the flickering torchlight. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment, burning herbs, and something metallic like dried blood. But it was what lay at the center of the room that made Nedu stiffen in horror. Piles upon piles of human bones, skulls stacked like trophies, rib cages crushed into dust, femurs arranged in strange patterns on the floor. Some were blackened and charred, others fresh, still gleaming under the dim light. And in the farthest corner, bound by thick iron chains, was something alive. It shifted slightly, the sound of rattling metal filling the air. Then two glowing eyes opened, locking onto Nedu.
Son of the king.
A deep rasping voice murmured. Nedu staggered back, his heart hammering.
Who? What?
Do not fear.
The voice whispered.
I am like you, a prince once.
The figure stepped forward, revealing a massive black leopard, its body covered in strange glowing symbols, its once golden fur matted with dirt and dried blood. Nedu's breath caught.
Agu?
He whispered. The leopard nodded slowly.
I was once like you, until it took me.
Nedu whipped around to face Oko, who had been watching silently.
What is this?
Nedu demanded, his voice trembling. The Dibia sighed, stepping forward.
You ask too many questions, child.
He said, his voice cold now.
Some knowledge is best left buried.
You imprisoned him.
Nedu snapped.
You turned him into this.
Oko studied him for a long moment. Then a slow, knowing smile crept onto his lips.
And what will you do about it, little prince?
Nedu's mind raced. His brothers Chima and Obi were asleep in their rooms, unaware of what was happening. He was alone with a powerful Dibia, a room of bones, and a trapped mystical being. He had to act fast. His gaze flickered to Agu's chains. The sacred symbols carved into them pulsed faintly, holding the creature in place. Magic? Powerful magic?
Agu,
He whispered, his voice barely above a breath.
can you break free?
The leopard growled lowly.
Not without help.
Nedu clenched his fists. If he could find a way to release Agu, they could escape. But Oko was watching, waiting, as though he already knew what was coming. Slowly, Nedu turned to face him fully.
You wanted to make us wise.
He said, his voice steady now.
Then teach me.
Oko's brows lifted slightly, but his amusement did not fade.
And what is it that you seek, young prince?
Power,
Nedu said quickly, hiding his true intent.
real power, the kind that made you what you are.
The Dibia's smile widened, interest flickering in his dark eyes.
Ah, now you understand.
He said smoothly. He stepped closer.
But true power comes with a cost. Are you ready to pay it?
Nedu nodded slowly, though his heart pounded.
Good.
Oko murmured.
Then let us begin.
But as Oko turned slightly to retrieve something from the wall, Nedu acted. In one swift motion, he grabbed a nearby torch and hurled it toward Agu's chains. The flames licked the symbols, and with a deafening roar, the sacred carving began to sizzle and crack. The air shook with raw energy, the room shuddering as a loud snap echoed. The chains broke. Agu lunged forward, his body pulsing with regained strength. His golden eyes flared, and in one powerful leap, he was upon Oko. A howl of rage and surprise split the air as the Dibia was slammed against the stone wall.
Run.
Agu roared. Nedu didn't hesitate. He spun on his heel and bolted out of the chamber, Agu right behind him. Oko's furious voice echoed through the halls.
You will regret this, child.
But Nedu didn't look back. He raced through the dark corridors, his heart hammering. He had done what he never thought possible. He had defied the Dibia. Chima awoke to the sound of distant shouting. His warrior instincts kicked in instantly, and he snatched up his dagger, moving toward the door. Obi was already awake, standing at the window.
What in the God's name is going on?
Chima demanded. Obi smirked, amused but cautious.
Looks like our little brother has been up to something interesting.
A second later, the doors burst open, and Nedu stumbled inside, his face flushed with urgency.
We have to leave now.
Chima blinked.
What?
There is no time. Oko is not what he seems. We were never meant to return home.
And how do you know this?
Before Nedu could answer, a deep growl filled the room. Chima and Obi froze.
That
Nedu panted, his chest rising and falling.
is how I know.
For once, Chima had no retort. Obi's smirk finally faded, and in the distance, the roar of an enraged Dibia shook the very foundation of the house. The hunt had begun. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the brothers stood frozen in their chambers, their eyes locked on the massive black leopard that stood beside Nedu. Chima's fingers twitched over the hilt of his dagger, his warrior instincts screaming at him to attack. Obi, always the strategist, took a cautious step back, his sharp eyes flicking between Agu and Nedu.
What is this madness?
Chima demanded, his voice sharp as a sword, yet low.
There's no time to explain.
Nedu shot back.
We have to leave now.
A deep, unearthly growl rumbled through the walls, shaking dust from the ceiling.
He is coming.
Agu warned, his golden eyes flashing.
If we do not move, you will never leave this place alive.
Chima clenched his jaw. He did not trust this creature, but Nedu had never led them astray before,
Fine.
he said at last.
But if you are lying,
I am not.
Nedu's eyes burned with conviction.
Now move.
The decision was made. The three brothers and Agu bolted from the chamber, racing down the dimly lit corridors, their hearts pounding in unison. The once silent house was now alive with whispers and shifting shadows. The wooden walls groaned as if something ancient and unseen was awakening. Strange symbols flickered in and out of existence, and the very air felt thick with invisible hands grasping at the skin.
The house is trying to trap us.
Obi hissed, his sharp mind already piecing together the danger.
Then we must outrun it.
Agu growled. Ahead the main door loomed. The exit was within reach. Just a few more steps. Then with a deafening boom, the entire entrance sealed itself as though the house had grown its own flesh. The wood twisted into an unnatural form, its carvings pulsing like a beating heart. A deep echoing voice filled the air. Dibia Oko's voice.
You dare betray me?
The sound of his rage was enough to shake the very walls.
You think you can leave my domain?
The shadows rushed toward them like a living tide.
To the courtyard. Now.
Agu commanded. Without hesitation, they veered left, sprinting toward the open-air courtyard at the center of the house. The moment they burst through the doors, they skidded to a halt. The ground beneath them was shifting, forming symbols of sacred script, writhing like snakes. The sky above was no longer the comforting dark of night, but a swirling abyss of red and black pulsating with an ominous energy. And there, in the center of the courtyard, stood Dibia Oko. His once calm expression was gone, replaced by one of pure fury. His robe billowed unnaturally around him, and his eyes, once dark and deep, now burned red like hot coal.
You disappoint me, Nedu.
He spat.
I offered you knowledge. I offered you power. And yet you choose weakness.
Nedu took a step forward. His fists clenched.
You never wanted to teach us. You only wanted another sacrifice.
Oko sneered.
And yet here you stand, alive, because I allowed it.
Chima, his warrior instincts surging, growled.
enough of this. We end this now.
He lunged forward, his dagger slicing through the air, but before he could land a blow, Oko raised his staff. A pulse of dark energy exploded outward. Chima was flung back, his body hitting the ground with a heavy thud.
You are nothing against me, boy.
Oko sneered. Obi, always calculating, watched carefully, his mind racing.
There has to be a way out.
He murmured to himself. Agu, standing beside Nedu, growled.
There is,
The leopard said.
but you must trust me. We cannot fight him head on,
Agu continued.
but I know how to break his hold on this house.
Nedu turned to him, eyes wide with hope.
How?
The great leopard's golden eyes softened.
You must let me go.
Nedu stiffened.
What do you mean?
Oko's power is tied to this house, to the souls he has trapped here. If I release all that remains, his magic will collapse. But you,
Nedu's voice caught in his throat.
I was lost, long before you found me, young prince.
Agu's deep voice was calm.
It is time.
Nedu shook his head.
Number, I won't let you.
You will.
Agu's roar shook the air, forcing everyone to stop. The great beast turned toward Oko, who was now gathering energy for another attack.
I am no longer bound,
Agu bellowed.
and neither are the souls you have stolen.
With that, Agu leaped into the air, his body igniting in golden flames. The courtyard erupted in light, and suddenly the ground cracked open. From beneath, the souls of the fallen, warriors, children, elders, rose like a mighty tide, swirling around Oko like a storm. The Dibia screamed, thrashing as his stolen power was ripped from him, his body shrinking, withering before their eyes.
No!
He howled.
This is my power.
But it was too late. His own magic turned against him, consuming him whole. With a final deafening crack, the entire House of Shadows collapsed, sending out a wave of golden energy that rippled through the valley. And just like that, Dibia Oko was no more. The first rays of the sun broke over the ruins of Oko's domain. The house, once a fortress of dark magic, was nothing but dust and scattered bones. Chima groaned, sitting up, rubbing his bruised ribs.
Did we win?
Obi chuckled, though there was an unusual softness in his voice.
Looks like it.
But Nedu did not celebrate. His eyes scanned the ruins. Searching,
Agu?
he called. His heart sank. A soft breeze swept through the valley, carrying the faint echo of a growl.
Thank you, young prince.
Nedu's eyes burned, but he knew Agu was finally free,
Come on,
he said.
let's go home.
And with that, the three sons of King Kanu turned toward the road, soon to leave behind the shadows of the past. Ahead of them, the future awaited. The journey back from Oko's ruined domain is going to be long, but the weight of their victory made each step lighter. The sun was beginning to rise. Behind them, the once feared House of Shadows was now nothing more than a pile of ruins, its magic forever broken. But before they left, Nedu and Agu had done something important. Something that would change his fate forever. When the Dibia fell, the magic that had bound his house and treasures weakened. Deep within the remains of the forbidden chamber, Nedu and Agu had found a hidden storage of gold, gems, and artifacts. Treasures that Oko had likely hoarded from countless victims over the years.
He stole from many.
Agu had said, his golden eyes scanning the piles of wealth.
It should not die with him.
Nedu hesitated only for a moment before nodding.
Then we will take it. Not for greed, but to build something better.
Using an old woven sack, he and Agu filled it with as much gold as they could carry. With their fortune secured, they left the ruined house behind, forever. When they finally arrived at Umuji, the village erupted into celebration. The palace guards spread the news first, shouting in joy. The people who had believed the three princes might never return rushed to welcome them back. At the palace, King Kanu and Queen Adara stood waiting. Their eyes, once filled with worry, softened as they saw their sons. Stronger, wiser, change,
You have returned.
the king said, his voice filled with pride. The brothers knelt before their father, but Nedu, no longer the timid boy who had left, stood tall.
We are not the same as when we left.
He said. And the king saw it too. Chima no longer carried arrogance but discipline. Obi no longer smacked with mischief, but calculated with wisdom. And Nedu, his youngest, once the most naive, had become something more. He had become a man of destiny. But what the king did not yet know was that Nedu's journey was far from over. For days, the brothers remained in Umuji, telling the full tale of their survival, of Dibia Oko's deception, the House of Shadows, and the great leopard, Agu. But Nedu knew one thing for certain. His journey was not meant to end here. He had returned, but he did not belong in Umuji anymore. He had seen the vastness of the world, had touched power, had outwitted a sorcerer, and had escaped the jaws of death, and he had gold. More gold than any man in Umuji had ever seen.
What do you plan to do with it?
Chima asked one evening as the two sat outside the palace, watching the stars. Nedu smiled.
I will find my own path,
Chima scoffed.
And leave us behind?
not leave,
Nedu corrected.
but move forward.
His mind was made up. With Agu by his side, Nedu left Umuji, venturing beyond the lands he had known. He crossed rivers, forests, and deserts, using the stolen gold to buy land, build homes, and trade with kings and warriors alike. With time, he became more than just the youngest prince of Umuji. He became a respected leader, a builder of cities, and a man whose wisdom was sought by rulers across the land. And in one of the great kingdoms he helped establish, he found love marrying a princess of noble blood. Thus his legend grew. Chima, the eldest, remained in Umuji, training warriors, preparing for the day he would take their father's place as king. Obi, the second, became a master of trade and diplomacy, using his wit to expand Umuji's influence. Though they lived apart, the three brothers remained bound by their journey, their trials, and the lessons they had learned. Many years later, as Nedu sat in the courtyard of his great home, a warm breeze stirred the air. In it, he could almost hear the deep, familiar growl.
You have done well, young prince.
Nedu smiled, looking toward the open lands beyond his city walls.
Thank you, Agu.
He whispered, for the great leopard had not only freed him from Oko's grasp, he had set him on the path to greatness. And so the story of Nedu, the youngest son of King Kanu, became legend.